I'm going to start with a poem by Gwen Bunaway, a Anishinaabe, Métis, and Scotch-descended local writer. Difficult. I'll say what I want. This passage is difficult, and I'm afraid. I would go home if it existed, if I wasn't trans and abandoned by God. I'd call my friends if I could explain want. Only the land gets me. I wish it was Christmas. I need twinkle lights and excuses to drink. Too many cigarettes. I regret the lung ache, but I crave company. I won't follow straight men on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. I swear it. When night comes, I won't jump from cliffs or disappear in dark water. I will go on. This is what I wanted. Freedom and choices. But I will say everything that crosses my mind. My dreams taste of cedar. This passage belongs to me, unceded land. My sovereignty carries me somewhere. It isn't the home I deserve, but it is my only country, wherever I land. So that's Gwen Bunaway. This talk is concerned with the ways in which something I call in my title over-identification, over-identify much, but which we might more properly describe as projection, Freud's term, or even projective identification, Melanie Klein's term, might be brought to bear upon narrative figures of erring, say, towards sexes and genders. With erring towards, I hope to contract several meanings and associations: to wander or go awry, to fall into error or lapse morally, to sin. It might seem perverse of me to locate the movement into sexes and genders as a mistake or a moral failing. And to be sure, it is perverse. To err is intransitive. It takes no object. And yet, after all, over-identify much is obviously as much an accusation, one to be enjoyed, as it is a diagnosis of over-enjoyment in identification. So what then is at stake when we begin to read symptomatically for exceptional errors and lapses, forgettings and leaps made en route to inhabiting and narrating identity? Do we suppose there are identities that are not so constituted through determining absences? Merriam-Webster offers this early example of error from Thomas Jones' 1678 book of the Heart and its Right Sovereign, which contains the line, "To err is human, to recover is angelical, to persevere is diabolical." So errancy has its valences. But what is it to be made an example of? Or who gets to make an example of what? Perhaps it would be less disingenuous if I owned an interest in querying how exceptions and examples, figuring errors and lapses, forgettings, excesses, leaps, are made in the service of constructing theoretical narratives, which in turn condition the inhabitation of sexed and gendered positions, within fields of political legibility. Suppose we tend towards telling in ways that begin us as identifiable, that imagine our identifiability as the ground of our social existence. Before getting to that, though, perhaps it is worth remembering that in 1996, trans sociologist Viviane Namaste diagnosed queer theory's political program as harvesting its political grounds from the figural use of transgender tropes, occluding the existence of transgender people as such. Here are the passages Namaste takes issue with in Butler's Bodies That Matter. Butler is discussing the fate of a Latina trans woman and sex worker, Venus Extravaganza, who is featured in Jenny Livington's by now famous and infamous documentary Paris is Burning. Wow, that font is super small. Now Venus Extravaganza, she seeks a certain transubstantiation of gender in order to find an imaginary man who will designate a class and race privilege that promises permanent shelter from racism, homophobia, and poverty. And it would not be enough to claim that for Venus gender is marked by race and class, for gender is not the substance or primary substrate, and race and class the qualifying attributes. In this instance, gender is the vehicle for the phantasmatic transformation of that nexus of race and class, the site of its articulation. Indeed, in Paris's Burning, becoming real, becoming a real woman, although not everyone's desire, some children merely want to do realness, constitutes the site of the phantasmatic promise of a rescue from poverty, homophobia, and racist delegitimation. A fantasy that for Venus, because she dies, killed apparently by one of her clients, perhaps after the discovery of those remaining organs, cannot be translated into the symbolic. This is a killing that is performed by a symbolic that would eradicate those phenomena that require an opening up of the possibilities of resignification of sex. If Venus wants to become a woman and cannot overcome being Latina, then Venus is treated by the symbolic in precisely the ways in which women of color are treated. Her death thus testifies to a tragic misreading of the social map of power. And this is the phrase that Namaste's critique turns upon. A tragic misreading of the social map of power. A misreading orchestrated by that very map according to which the sites for phantasmatic self-overcoming are constantly resolved into disappointment. If the signifiers of whiteness and femaleness, as well as some forms of hegemonic maleness constructed through class privilege, are sites of phantasmatic promise, then it is clear that women of color and lesbians are not only everywhere excluded. And I'll stop there. So Namaste gives one response in suggesting that queer theory grounds its own theoretical program, the articulation of gender performativity, through this figuration of a falling trans woman of color, and its own misreading of her in a way that occludes her transness and her work as a prostitute. Here is another possible response, and this is Cameron Awkward-Rich's Theory of Motion 4, Nocturne. I've tried not to write about these ghosts, as if this too does not turn a child to narrative, as if this too does not demand a kind of work, but boy after boy after boy after boy after girl after sweet outline of a boy. And have you ever known a body not to be haunted? Ever known a black body to not be riddled with light? Once I was a girl who took a black boy's name into her mouth. I don't know a thing about bullets, but I sure do know about holes. So over-identification otherwise, taken, known, prefigured, or retrospectively, in the scopic, in the ledger, is an available calculus with brute force that says you, brute, you. Or not even addressing, because who addresses a brute? But elaborating an arrangement for speaking about, for, beyond, its instrumentality and objects. Are there errors, lapses, unconscious wishes there? What need for unconscious wishes, lapses, errors, when conscious will is so observably malignant? So observe this observing. The Schreber case, 1911, is key to Freud's thinking on projection. Its use as a reflexive defense against instinctual drive impulses, as a consequence of which object-directed drive impulses are experienced as directed against the self by an external object. So here drive impulse remains dynamically unconscious, while unconsciousness screens a projection. Freud's theory of symptom formation in paranoia is hermeneutically read through the Schreber case. And this is a long quotation. The proposition, quote, I, a man, love him, end quote, is contradicted by A, delusions of persecution, for they loudly assert, quote, I do not love him, I hate him, end quote. This contradiction, which must have run thus in the unconscious, cannot, however, become conscious to a paranoiac in this form. The mechanism of symptom formation in paranoia requires that internal perceptions, feelings, shall be replaced by external perceptions. Consequently, the proposition, quote, I hate him, end quote, becomes transformed by projection into another one. He hates, persecutes me, which will justify me in hating him. And thus the impelling unconscious feeling makes its appearance, as though it were the consequence of an external perception, quote, I do not love him, I hate him because he persecutes me, end quote. Observation leaves room for no doubt that the persecutor is someone who was once loved. And that's the end of Freud. Well, not really the end of Freud. But as I've argued elsewhere, and others have argued well before me, the overdetermined name of Schreber is itself arguably the scene of a radical misreading, one in which the interpretation of the cross-sexed wish as a symptom of repressed homosexuality proves consequential for a century of misdiagnosis. It's as if there were a proper diagnosis. You'll know the name of Daniel Paul Schreber. It's Split, a proverbial divided subject, but not like you or me. Like you or me, Daniel Paul Schreber is beside himself or herself, cut up, top from bottom, with two destinies or more. More, I suspect. In this room, I suspect more destinies, more. More than the most famous mental patient in history. In this room, Daniel Paul Schreber is first and foremost, most likely, Anti-Oedipus, a body without organs, patron signifier of schizoanalysis, and or, more than Freud's only case study of a psychotic whose delusion uncannily encodes Freud's libido theory and his theory that psychosis and paranoia arise from repressed homosexuality. Freud said it himself. Quote, Schreber's delusional formation sounds almost like endosomatic perceptions of the processes whose existence I have assumed as the basis of paranoia, end quote. And further, quote, I can nevertheless call a friend and fellow specialist to witness that I had developed my theory of paranoia before I became acquainted with the contents of Schreber's book. It remains for the future to decide whether there is more delusion in my theory than I should like to admit, or whether there is more truth in Schreber's delusions than other people are as yet prepared to believe, end quote. And that's from the Psychoanalytic Notes. So more than well known, as a signifier, the name of Schreber has become overwrought and overdetermined. And now I'm going to read two poems that take up Schreber's text and mobilize them within an interrogation of the archives of representations of the beyond of sex, which constitute the discursive and figural grounds through which trans subjects have been able to articulate themselves over the course of the last century or so. First, to name the famous delusion, the wish, the fantasy, quote, to submit to the act of copulation as a woman, end quote. A judge cannot contemplate her body in bed submitting, her arse, a temple, to manhood. A beautiful feeling fucked free of judgment. Fuck my sex out, fuck the god out, fuck my brains out. A god cannot be a judge in of her body. Quote, what a delightful feeling to be without one's sex, one's judge, I mean one's submission, end quote. To be without the whole wealth of knowing, sex thusly knowing the English love of pattern, gardens, galaxies at the end. One cannot but want to be bruised, ass-fucked, emblazoned, ripe, and purple, known, biblically speaking, across the firmament. And to really make it concrete, itinerary of a book, Anxiety of Influence, unmanning how a book could travel, great thoughts of a nerve patient, the most famous patient in the history of psychiatry, they say, unmanning the voices trilling like birds, gendered metaphors along the nerves of a body becoming the thought, after all, it must be very nice to be a woman submitting to the act of copulation, unmanning, not unreasonably, the fear of those doctors, but surely mad, unmanning at the end of that century's end, mad becoming impossible speech, an impossible position, a sex that was not one, so sure, mad, becoming unmanning, a bellowing miracle, a cold wind blowing through a body's hollow with becoming deposits in nerves on nerve skin as nerve speech, sinuous, sensuous miracle, the jolt of unmanning. Freud, in the reading, wondering to himself, to you here, almost exactly a century later, whether there is more, blah, 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 yet prepared to believe. Unmanning, passing from Schreber's hands to paper scraps, to his, her cell, from Saxon judge, family man, not a father, proto-nationalist, proto-national socialist. When did he become? Did she become God's whore, golden girl, her chosen, or at least someone? Unmanned away, anyway, in the pages Denken ein Nerven Kranken, in Freud's hands, psychoanalytic notes on an autobiographic account of a case of paranoia, and translated into English, Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. Unmanning, can reading a book change your sex? Margaret Mead made me gay, they say. They used to. But Freud defended himself manfully against all that unmanning lewder shit. No, he was not going to become writing, his spinning, his theory, his unconscious, his sex. Unmanning, no, he would not be. Not a woman in another man's arms, not a prostitute, a whore for some foreign god. Not lewder shit, prostitute, homosexual Jew, or woman becoming not Jew, homosexual shit, prostitute becoming homosexual. Not a delusion, just this. Writing, the cross-sex wish, a symptom of the patient's repressed homosexuality, harbinger of their savior fantasies, paranoia. A century of that. Thank you, Doctor. Okay, and that's that. Thanks very much.